How many game developers in the room? Great. What's the question you ask yourself every time you make a game? Where am I going to put it? Why am I doing this? What's the goal? So you come up with a great idea for a game. You're like, this game is perfect. Then you have to think about where you're going to put it. And you have these really tough decisions to make. Do you go online? Do you go mobile? Do you go to the Steam PC world? What is the right world for your game content? What is the right world for you to be developing to? As a developer myself, those are questions we ask ourselves all the time. And sometimes you pick the right way, sometimes you don't. That's kind of the luck of the draw. But you try to put some thought into it. And we have David CHIU and Peter EYKEMANS. And he's giving me the Dutch pronunciation, which I've already forgotten. Sorry about that. And they're going to talk a little bit more about, from a Congregate perspective, their advice on some ideas of where to make your games and how to distribute them. Gentlemen?
Hello, good morning. So hi, I'm David CHIU. I'm the Director of Developer Relations and Business Development at Congregate. And this is my colleague, Peter. So in this presentation, we'll talk about making the right game with focus on free-to-play, because that's what we focus on. And we'll tell you the benefits of doing a free-to-play game. And also take a step back before we go into that and explain the different models that are available and why we think free-to-play is a superior model for certain developers for certain type of games. So, as a platform, Congregate has a unique perspective of what type of game mechanics work best, especially in free-to-play games, since we have hundreds of them on our platform. So we'll be sharing a lot of stats and best practices so you understand what are the ingredients that lead to strong long-term retention and monetization in free-to-play games. But before we jump into all that, a quick intro of what is Congregate. So Congregate is an open platform for browser-based games. Anything that runs within a browser, Flash, Unity, HTML5, Java, etc., we support. Unity games actually do a lot better on Congregate than other platforms because more than 96% of our users already have Unity installed. So there's a lot less friction to people beginning playing a game on Congregate. We have over 21 million monthly unique visitors worldwide who are core gamers, 85% male with an average age of 22 who like MMOs, RPGs, collectible card games, trading card games, tower defense games, strategy games, shooters, and so forth. For our web platform, we have a virtual currency called Creds for free-to-play games. And we are part of the GameStop family. We were acquired back in July of 2010. Congregate is also a mobile publisher of free-to-play games. Here are a few of the games that we've published on mobile so far that have been featured by Apple and Google and also promoted extensively on Congregate.com and through GameStop. Gotten features by Apple and Google, and a lot of you have probably played a lot of these games. And we work with developers of all shapes and sizes, from small independent developers like Ironhide of Kingdom Rush fame to big multinational companies like the ones you see here.
So as David said, as we were getting started, if any of you have been to our talks before, we're very heavy on the data and everything we've learned from our platform so far. We've seen over 400 free-to-play games come and go. But we wanted to take a step back this time and do kind of a partial higher level overview of a few various models and kind of understanding what making the right game for your team means. So to that extent, think about your team. How big you are, what capabilities you have. Do you have guys for server backend? Are you able to handle long-term MMO development to keep players in your game? Or are you looking at making more of a standalone product that players are going to see one time and play through it and be done, which is more of kind of a premium version? While free-to-play works really well for us, we're not of the mindset that it's for everything or for every type of game. So to that extent, you need to think about your goals. What do you want to get out of the experience? Is this going to be a case where you're trying to drive a ton of volume to get your name out there and have people start to get into your games and understand what you can do? Are you trying to drive high revenues? Or are you just trying to get your first project done and kind of have a win for yourself as you're going? So to that extent, different revenue models are better for different types of games. And that's one of the kind of aspects we wanted to go over. So the big question to be asking yourself all along, what does success mean to you? Do you need to make a ton of money to keep your studio afloat? Are you just looking to make a couple bucks for your time that you've invested so far into your projects? So let's take a look at how various revenue models might break down. you might hear people say, oh, free-to-play is the future, or free-to-play is the end of the industry. You get kind of a little from column A, a little from column B, but the truth is there's no single revenue model that's going to take over everything. Because for every type of game, every type of model, there's success for somebody. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about paid apps, ad-supported free apps, how we kind of got started on the web, PC, Steam games, more of the indie variety, freemium apps where you have a single purchase, but you can get the game generally for free. Look a little bit at casual games, and then dig really deeply into hardcore free-to-play games, which is what we know the best and what we've learned the most about. So we've kind of taken some hypothetical examples. We've pulled some numbers. We've made some estimates. These are for argument's sake. These aren't pulled from our own experience. They're just questions you should be asking yourself when it comes back to the idea of what does success mean to you. So they show dynamics based on the volume you're going to be driving, the average revenue per paying user, which is going to be a set price point if you're a premium game. It's going to be different if you're a free-to-play game where players can have multiple levels of purchasing, or it's which will vary based across the type of game. So let's take a quick look at one example of a paid app. Again, these are estimates and kind of more of a worksheet. So none of these are guarantees that if you make this type of game, this is the exact story you're going to tell. Some of you will look at this and be like, wow, that's a great success. And again, what is success to you? Some of you are going to look at this and think it's crazy and super low and we're insane. But for some examples, let's take a look at the current top 3 paid apps in the US App Store. We have Threes, which is a great puzzle matching game at $1.99. Second game, top downloaded game, is Red Bouncing Ball Spikes, 99 cents, half the price of the first one. And then a game called Minecraft, which you may or may not have heard of at this point, that's pricing a little more aggressively at $6.99. So for the download rankings, we know it's a power curve. The first game in the list is going to have a lot more downloads than the second, and the second's going to have a lot more downloads than the third. So based on their pricing and based on that concept of a power curve, where does that place them in the top grossing list? For Threes, currently, they're 32nd in the top grossing rankings of the US App Store at $1.99. So Red Bouncing Ball, you cut that price in half and step down to the second place in the downloads list. It's actually quite surprising the dip you're going to see. They're all the way down at 167th in the top grossing list right now. But then if you look into Minecraft, which is third, and obviously has fewer downloads than both the games before it, while it's pricing more aggressively, it actually lands up at 22nd, which is 10 slots higher than Threes, the #1 downloaded game in the App Store. So in general, from what we've seen and experienced, developers price their apps generally too low. At 99 cents, you're just not going to see the volume to make the revenue that might mean success to your company back. But for a lot of developers, that's perfectly fine, and that is success. I wanted to make a quick note that a big IP, something like Final Fantasy VI, which is pricing even more aggressively, kind of in the XCOM, the super premium mobile model that we've seen kind of recently, while it's a roughly in the 40s in the top downloads for iOS, it's actually placed closer to the #1 game due to its higher pricing. The higher pricing is going to drive more revenue, even if it's fewer installs. So something to think about. One developer I follow, a game I love called Barbarians, came out last month. Shortly, they got a fantastic Apple feature, the biggest banner you can get in the games portion of the App Store, which is kind of the holy grail for a lot of developers to drive that organic traffic that you're not acquiring users on and buying users into your game. About 24 hours later, they tweeted that they had gotten 9,000 installs. And for them, this is great, and I'm super happy for them, and that's what they wanted to see out of this. But for some companies, that's not going to be enough. So it's one story to think about as you're trying to figure out the right type of game, right type of model for your game. This is well outside our wheelhouse, but again, estimates, worksheets, things to think about when you're making your type of game. We're looking at an average revenue per paying user at $79 because we're assuming an indie-style game on Steam. Generally, it would be $15 to $20, but a lot of the volume there is driven by sales and discounts, where players see definite spikes in the volume. And because it's a 100% conversion rate as a premium game, a lot of your revenue is going to be driven this way. But you have to consider that when you're going the downloadable route for a PC or Steam game, A, it's super hard to get on Steam. B, you're competing with $60 AAA titles that have all the marketing budgets in the world. And then you have anomalies like DayZ, which rode out the entire Steam winter sale at full price of $30, and they announced shortly thereafter they had already pushed more than 1 million copies into market. But that's an exception, that's not the rule. So these are more considerations you need to take into account when you're designing your type of game and trying to figure out where you fit in the marketplace. So we take a quick look. There's ad-supported free games where the revenue varies greatly depending on the ad networks you're using, and they rely almost entirely on volume. So if you have a game that can succeed on volume, this may be the right model for you. And it's a case where maybe you're just trying to get a project done, get a project out in the marketplace, and see what happens. Then there's the casual free-to-play games. We don't deal heavily in these, but in general, the volume of downloads is going to be up. You have a wide funnel. You're going to capture a lot of different types of players and get those players into your game at a lower average revenue per paying user, because the in-app purchases are generally smaller than you'd see in a more core game. So this is actually pretty generous. Again, we're making estimates. We're making worksheets. Don't take any promises from these, but it's things, again, to think about as you're going towards a game. The same sort of style with a freemium game, where the ARPU is super capped with a single purchase. You're probably going to see some of the worst results here, because you're going to see the same amount of conversions from a player who downloads the game to someone who's actually going to buy basically the full version of a game. So let's dig into hardcore free-to-play games, the scenario we know very well. You've heard as games as a service. In fact, this whole track is called games as a service. But our real kind of motto at Congregate, if you've heard Emily talk about it before, and she was going to be here initially. She apologizes, she couldn't. We think of it as games as a hobby. Hobby's going to be expensive. If you're playing golf, tennis, or paying for a monthly gym membership, those costs add up. So when you're playing a game over the course of months and years, this is a case where it's not that crazy to have a higher average revenue per paying user of hundreds of dollars, which is quite the norm with the successful types of games we've seen. And hardcore free-to-play games, it's not kind of like a one package, you put it on the market, and you're done. That's just launch is the start. A lot of people say this, you've heard this. But the best games have consistent updates, new content, community support, live events, things that keep players engaged for the long term, because that's where you end up making the majority of your revenue, from players who stick around for a long time. So to that idea, it works because free-to-play uncaps the amount a player can spend. It's going to be hundreds. You're going to have players who can spend thousands of dollars. And one thing you do have to ask yourself, are you comfortable with that? To one kind of balancing thing, if you think about it, a player playing World of Warcraft for 2 years, there's a cost of entry. And if you're paying a subscription, that's almost $400 all in for 2 years of gameplay. And successful hardcore games are going to take the same amount of time. You are going to retain players that long. And it's a matter of giving them something fun. If they don't like the game, if they don't love the game, they're going to leave. Just because you add an in-app purchase shop to a game doesn't mean you're going to win, doesn't mean you're going to trick players into making you super successful. The whole idea is that free-to-play is this ultimate, in-your-face, vote with your dollars marketplace. If people don't like your game, you're not going to make money. So making a great game, unfortunately, is the hardest part. I think you're all very aware of that. So let's look at one version of this. Because hardcore is a little bit more niche, you may see slightly less volume, but conversion rates are going to be strong throughout, because these are players who want to enhance their experience, really dig into a game. And the ARPUs are going to be up. The average revenue per paying user are going to be well beyond a casual game because of the amount of time a player spends in the game and their ability to spend over time. So let's get into a little bit of background. I'll pass it back to David to dig into some of what we've learned on the web for this style of game.
So before we jump into the stats, I want to provide a little background so we all know what we're talking about, since everyone defines stats differently. So first of all, these are all lifetime stats for games that have been on the platform for at least 6 weeks. ARPU is average revenue per user. RPPU is average revenue per paying user. A player is a Congregate registered user that has played the game or loaded the game at least once. And game plays is number of sessions. This is our preferred way of measuring retention instead of D1, D7, and D30 retention. While they're good stats, they don't tell the full story. For example, a player can play a game twice in 30 days or 200 times in 30 days. And those are two very different type of players that D30 retention doesn't capture. So here you'll see for all the games on Congregate, we have graphed the RPPU and RPU. You can see that the RPPU on the bottom axis can go all the way up to $500 average revenue per paying user. And for the average revenue per user, it could go up as high as $10. And there's a very big range. And you may be asking, what do top games do that lower performing games don't do? So in the next few slides, we'll explain some of the key ingredients to building a successful free-to-play game for core gamers. Some things I want to point out here is that for single-player games, there's a cluster at the bottom. Single-player games tend to have ARPPUs of like $5 to $10, while multiplayer games range in ARPPU of $20 to almost $500. Here we're graphing the top multiplayer games versus games outside of the top. So the red line are the top games, and you can see there's a very linear relationship between spending over time. The more people spend, the more time people spend in the game, the higher the ARPPU of the game. So for actually some games on Congregate, they have hit their 2 and 3 year anniversaries, and are still making a substantial amount of money, or even more money than they did when they first launched. So commitment really matters. Here we're breaking down players by number of time they play the game. Non-repeats are people who play the game once. Repeats are people who play the game 2 times or more. Regulars are 10 times or more. And commit are people who play the game 50 times or more. You can see that purchasing behavior varies substantially by how much they play the game. The more they play, the more they're likely to buy. People that play the game 50 times or more, almost 16.5% of them convert from playing to paying, do 7 transactions on average, spending about $100. And even though there are only 7% of players that account for 84% of revenue. Here we'll break it down even more. For the top 10 multiplayer games, you can see that players that have played the game 500 times or more, almost 40% of them are converting to paying players, spending on average $270 with 14 transactions at $19 a piece. So even though there are 1.1% of players, they account for 62% of revenue. So in order to keep monetizing players, you have to keep them around. And the more things they have to do, the more players end up staying. Here we have a screenshot from a game called Wartune, which is a Chinese MMO with a lot of different features. You can see that it has a very busy screen and crazy UI because this game has a lot of features. Solo and team PvE, PvP, synchronous raids, skill battles, war boss raids, a whole bunch of other features. So while more is better, it is important to pace the introduction of new gameplay modes and features to not overwhelm the user with a long, intimidating, or boring tutorial. And without progress, you have nothing. In order to have that sense of provide a sense of progress and retain players, you need RPG-like elements. That means having a player level up their characters, add improved skills, stats, and so forth. And surprisingly, it's even more important than having multiplayer in your game. But of course, having both is ideal. Here you can see that we're comparing single-player games with no RPG elements with a single player with RPG elements, multiplayer game with no RPG elements, and a multiplayer game with RPG elements. And going from single-player game with no RPG elements to a multiplayer game with RPG elements, it's a 25x difference when it comes to monetization. So having these two features definitely retains and monetizes players a lot better. But not all types of multiplayer are created equal. Here you can see that asynchronous multiplayer actually retains and monetizes players better in the long run. The reason why synchronous multiplayer is better is because players like to play at their own convenience and their own pace. They don't want to wait around for the room to fill up or wait for their friends to be online in order to be able to play a match. And asynchronous multiplayer is typically a lot easier to design for and support on the back end. So developers have to worry less about the technology and can focus more on improving the game. But if you have players around, you have to make sure that there's stuff for them to buy, and interesting stuff. So the longer someone plays your game, the more likely they are to buy, and the less price sensitive they become. So give committed players the ability to spend $1,000 or more if they want. Have a lot of items that are higher priced for late stage players. A higher price means $30 to $100, not $1,000. If you make a game fun, someone could play it for years and spend hundreds or sometimes even thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in it. Like Peter said, it's a hobby. So think about how much people spend in golf, in cars. It's not an insane amount, given how much entertainment you get out of it over the years. So don't create a situation where spending is capped by availability or utility. Don't have one ultra powerful item that they can buy for $20 and then they don't need to buy anything else. That would just ruin the game experience for them because the game will become too easy and then they would just not stick around. And make it easy for them to buy what they want. Another common feature about from top multiplayer games are guilds. Okay. Our top games have guilds in them. Guild members tend to spend 10 to 20 times more than non-guild members. This doesn't mean that if you join a guild that you'll spend that much more, but there's a strong correlation, and there's some reasons why. Social incentives to return. I want to see my friends and keep playing with them. I don't want to disappoint them, so I have the social pressure to return. Improves the psychology of purchasing, so I'm not just buying for myself, but I'm buying for the clan or the guild. And it changes the dynamics of free-to-play. So, you have players that are time-rich and money-poor, and money-rich and time-poor on both ends of the spectrum, and they can both contribute equally to the guild, but in different ways. And lastly, just the value of developer activity. Like Peter said, it's very important to continually improve, update your game with new features, have events, listen to your player feedback. So this is a game called Fantasy Online that had a very humble beginning at Congregate. It was well-liked, had a high rating, had good retention, but had very poor monetization when it first started. It only had a $5 monthly ARPPU. Over time, we worked closely with this developer to help them improve their monetization. And in the end, they were able to improve the monthly ARPPU 10 times to $55. That's not huge compared to the games that have, few $100 ARPPUs on Congregate, but it's a huge improvement, especially that this is a developer of just one person. This was a big Asian MMO that didn't do updates and add new features, so they even though they had a big launch, they lost all the momentum afterwards. And here we have another game called Green World from an indie developer that had a humble beginning as well, but through continued updates and improvements and events, they're able to increase their monthly revenue substantially. And actually, one more thing. What genres work best? So some of the best subgenres we've seen on Congregate are Empire Builders, CCGs, and Loot Fest. Loot Fest being kind of like a collectathon game where you're collecting better gear, better weapons, better equipment, and so forth. While the poorest performing genres, in terms of monetization, tend to be pet battlers, artillery games, and shooters. It doesn't mean that these type of games can't succeed, but inherently these genres monetize at a lower level, so their success is more dependent on volume. But they do appeal to a wider audience. So, thank you very much for your time. If you're interested in a copy of this presentation, you can email us at bd@congregate.com. For more talks and data, you can visit our developer website at developers.congregate.com. If you have a web game, web free-to-play game that you want to distribute on Congregate, you can email us at apps@congregate.com. And for our mobile publishing program, it's mobile@congregate.com. Thank you.
So before we wrap it up, let's give them a couple minutes for questions. Does anyone have anything in the audience?
One thing we wanted to reiterate was the estimate worksheets I was talking about earlier with the different models. That doesn't mean if you leave this room and go make a hardcore free-to-play game, you're going to make $1 million. It's just some concepts to think about, and the idea really is, what does success mean to you? What can your team reasonably pull off? And if you're going to make a hardcore free-to-play game, come talk to us, because we have plenty of data, plenty of advice. And as part of coming to the platform, one of our big value adds is that whether you end up coming or not, we're happy to help you with all of those things. Because when you guys succeed, we succeed. So we have a very open partnership in that regard.
That's great. I have one question. Based on some of the other presentations that happened earlier, they were talking about revenue coming from microtransactions versus advertising. Do you see a common mix? Because I noticed your charts seem to be more event-based or microtransaction-based monetization. But in your ARPU, are you calculating in things like advertising into the revenue?
Actually, for our free-to-play games, we tend to suppress ads because we want to minimize friction and have the players get into the game as soon as possible and start playing the game and get hooked and eventually spend instead of introducing ads before they even see the game.
The potential revenues from in-app purchases far outweigh what a successful free-to-play game will far outweigh what it can make in advertising. So by removing that element, which can be annoying to players, we generally see retention go up and less annoyance through that channel.
Any other questions? Thank you, guys.